I arrived at the venue a few minutes early, my coat buttoned against the damp Massachusetts air. The glass doors reflected rows of twinkling lights inside the kind of extravagant atmosphere Darius favored for his events. I carried a small leather bag close to my side, its weight familiar and reassuring. Inside were the trust fund documents and the key to the beach cottage, his real birthday gift. I had imagined the moment I would hand them to him, how his eyes might soften with gratitude. The music was already pulsing as I stepped in. Waitstaff in black and white weaved through a crowd of sequined dresses and tailored suits. Every corner seemed designed for a photo op balloon arches champagne towers, a cake taller than a small child. I scanned the tables looking for my name. The glossy place cards shimmered under soft lighting, but mine was nowhere to be found. I smoothed the edge of my scarf and told myself it was a minor oversight. People were laughing, posing, tagging each other on social media. I kept to the side content to wait until Darius noticed me. Then the music stopped. The DJ lowered the volume and every head turned toward the stage, where Seren stood holding the microphone with one hand and resting the other on her hip. Her lips curled into a practiced smile before she pointed straight at me. "You're not welcome here," she announced, her voice amplified and cutting through the room. "This is family only." A murmur ran through the guests. I felt the air in the room shift heavy and expectant. I looked toward my son. Darius was standing just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the champagne flute in his hand, as if the bubbles inside were far more interesting than what was happening to his mother. I tightened my grip on the leather bag. Every instinct told me to speak, to defend myself, but my voice stayed locked in my chest. The lights seemed brighter, the silence sharper, and I realized that walking away would be the only dignified move left to me. I turned toward the exit, each step measured already, knowing I would remember his silence longer than her words. The night air met me like a wall as I stepped outside, the echo of Seren's voice still ringing in my ears. I didn't rush to the car. I moved slowly, letting the click of my heels on the pavement keep me steady. When I finally slid behind the wheel, I sat for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the glow of the street lamp on the hood. On the drive home, memories crept in uninvited. Last Thanksgiving, Seren had suggested we keep it intimate and trim the guest list. I didn't realize until later that I'd been left out of the official family photos. She'd smiled sweetly when I noticed, blaming it on a mix-up with the photographer. I thought about Darius in the early years, calling me close to midnight because he couldn't figure out how to manage his debts, his voice tight with worry. I'd sat at my kitchen table with a calculator talking him through refinancing, even offering my name as co-signer on his first office lease. He had thanked me over and over back then, promising he'd never forget what I'd done. When Seren entered the picture, she brought an easy polish that drew people in. She knew how to command a room, how to make Darius seem bigger than he was. I told myself she was good for him even when she began making decisions without him, without either of us, under the guise of efficiency. At first, I stayed out of it. It wasn't my marriage, but I began to see how the edges of my place in Darius's life were being trimmed away, small slice by small slice, until tonight, when she had taken a carving knife to the whole thing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the street was quiet and dark. I carried my bag inside and set it on the dining table without opening it. The leather felt heavier than it had in the morning, as if it already knew it might never reach the hands it was meant for. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window, catching on the edge of the leather bag, still sitting in the center of the dining table. I hadn't moved it since I set it down the night before. Its presence was a quiet reminder of what the night was supposed to have been: a celebration, a moment of giving. I pulled out a chair and sat down, my hands resting on the table's smooth surface. The clasp clicked softly as I opened the bag, And there it was. The cream envelope with the trust documents neatly folded and secured, and beside it the small silver key to the beach cottage. I had imagined handing them over after the cake was cut, picturing Darius's face lighting up the guests, clapping maybe even a toast in return. I picked up the key, feeling the cool metal against my skin. That cottage had been a careful choice. 2 summers ago, I'd walked through its sunlit rooms hearing the distant crash of waves against the shore. I thought of Darius there with Talia teaching her how to fish from the pier, grilling on the small back deck, letting the salt air clear away the stress of his work. But now, those images felt like they belonged to someone else's family. The thought of handing him this gift after watching him stand by as Serin humiliated me sat wrong in my chest. I placed the key back in the bag and closed it firmly. I made tea and carried it to the living room, curling into my chair as steam curled from the cup. My gaze drifted back to the dining table, to the bag that now felt more like a line in the sand than a token of love. By the time the tea had cooled, I knew I wouldn't be delivering that gift as planned. Not now, maybe not ever. And as the hours passed, I began to wonder if keeping it might be the only way to protect more than just my pride. A week later, I met Cordell for lunch at a quiet cafe tucked away from the main street. She'd been my friend for decades, the kind who never needed a preamble to slip into conversation. Halfway through our salads, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "I've been hearing things about Serin," she said, stirring her iced tea without looking at me. "Some of her sponsorships have dried up. A few brands have moved on to younger faces. She's been leaning hard on Darius to cover the gaps." I set my fork down. Cordell went on, describing the luxury trips splashed across Serin's social media, the designer outfits she wore only once, the leased SUV with a payment that could cover someone's rent. All of it, she said, was being funded by Darius and not from business profits. When I asked what she meant, Cordell's gaze held mine. "He's been pulling from his retirement account. I don't think he's told you." The words landed like a stone in my stomach. I'd spent years teaching Darius about financial responsibility, watching him rebuild after the reckless spending of his 20s. Now, it seemed we were back at the beginning, only this time with someone else steering the wheel. As Cordell talked, my mind went to the documents in that leather bag at home. If I gave him the trust fund now, I could almost see how quickly it would dissolve, sold off to cover more luxury, more image building, more of Serin's idea of a life. I nodded absently as Cordell changed the subject, but my thoughts stayed on one track. The gift I had planned wasn't just a gesture anymore, it was a lifeline. And in the wrong hands, it would be a rope tightening around his neck. By the time we parted ways, my decision was starting to take shape, even if I hadn't spoken it aloud. That night, I pulled the leather bag closer, my fingers resting on the envelope, and began thinking about how to make sure it would never become their safety net. 2 days later, I called Aureline Frost, my attorney. Her voice was warm but precise, the way it always had been when we worked through estate planning years ago. I asked if she could fit me in that week. She did. Her office smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish, the shelves lined with neat rows of binders. I handed her the envelope from my bag, explaining what had happened at the party, what Cordell had told me, and why I could no longer hand over the trust as it was. Aureline listened without interrupting her pen, moving in tidy strokes across her yellow pad. When I finished, she set the pen down. "We can amend the terms," she said. "Add conditions. If he meets them, he inherits as planned. If not, the assets pass directly to the secondary beneficiary." "Talia," I said immediately. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. Then she nodded. Together, we rewrote the conditions Darius would need to be free of high-interest debt and financially stable for 2 consecutive years before accessing the trust. If he failed to meet that, the funds would bypass him entirely and go to Talia when she turned 21. As we reviewed the clauses, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring the work of my life and my husband's life didn't vanish into someone else's vanity. Once the trust was amended, we turned to the cottage. Aureline drafted the paperwork to move it into a separate holding under my name, shielded from any claim Darius might make without meeting similar conditions. By the time I left her office, the envelope in my bag no longer felt like a gift waiting to be given. It was a safeguard one that now had walls around it. At home, I placed the updated documents back in the bag and slid it onto the highest shelf of my study. It was no longer simply a matter of whether I would give it, now it was about when and under what terms. And I knew those terms had just changed everything. A week later, I stopped by a small cafe near the waterfront for an afternoon coffee. The place was crowded, so I took a seat at the far corner table, half hidden by a tall potted fern. I had just opened my notebook when a familiar voice floated over the hum of conversation. It was Serene. She was 2 tables away, angled, so she didn't see me. Her phone pressed to her ear. Her tone was light, almost giddy. "As soon as his mother hands over the house money, we'll be out of that loft," she said. "Flip it quick and we can clear the credit cards. Maybe even get that place in Miami." "He won't fight me on it, he never does." I set my pen down. She laughed, then a sharp, self-satisfied sound that made my shoulders tighten. "Honestly, I don't even care about the birthday mess. It got her out of the way, didn't it? Now he's focused on me exactly where he should be." I kept my gaze on my coffee cup, my heartbeat steadying into something colder. The words, "house money," told me everything. She wasn't imagining my gift, she was counting on it. And the public humiliation at the party hadn't been a loss of temper. It had been a step in a plan. She wrapped up her call, slid on her sunglasses, and left without noticing me. I waited until the door closed behind her before taking a slow breath. My fingers rested on the leather cover of my notebook, but I didn't write a single word. There was nothing to untangle. I had just heard it all plain and unvarnished. When I left the cafe, the air outside felt sharper, as if the whole street had shifted focus. The decision I'd made with Aureline now felt less like a precaution and more like a necessity. By the time I reached my car, I already knew this wouldn't end quietly. The only question left was when I would let them realize just how wrong their calculations had been. 2 months passed before I heard from Darius again. His voice on the phone was careful, the way people sound when they're stepping onto thin ice. He said he wanted to have a small family dinner, just the 3 of us to clear the air. I could hear movement in the background, the clink of glassware, and then Serene's voice muffled, but distinct, saying, "It'll look good." I agreed without hesitation. My tone was warm, even light, and I thanked him for thinking of me. We settled on a date for the following week. As soon as we hung up, I reached for the envelope on the top shelf of my study. The amended trust documents were still pristine, the key to the cottage tucked neatly beside them. I set them on my desk and dialed Aureline. By noon, we had an appointment arranged for the morning of the dinner to finalize the property transfer on the cottage and ensure all filings for the trust amendment were properly recorded. Over the next few days, I prepared without fuss. I had no interest in rehearsing speeches or plotting scenes. What I carried would speak for itself. My part was simply to present it plainly and without apology. The morning of the dinner, I signed the last of the papers in Aureline's office, feeling the faint satisfaction of a lock clicking shut. When I left, the documents were in my bag once again, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer an anticipated gift. They were a record of my decision, one that no one could undo without my consent. That evening, I dressed simply and took my time driving across town. The sun was low, the streets washed in that golden light that makes everything seem softer than it is. but my focus was sharp. When I stepped up to their door, I could hear voices and laughter inside. I knocked once steady and waited for the moment to unfold. Darius opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Serin appeared behind him, her greeting bright and practiced. The dining table was set for 3 candles flickering in glass holders, a roast resting in the center, as though this were a holiday. We exchanged polite words as we sat down. Conversation stayed on safe ground, weather work, small updates about Talia. I let them steer, answering when needed, waiting until the plates were pushed back and the dessert sat untouched in the middle. That was when I reached into my bag and placed the envelope on the table in front of Darius. "This," I said evenly, "is what I had intended for you on your birthday." He glanced at Serin before opening it. His eyes moved over the pages, confusion tightening into something sharper. "I'm not the beneficiary." "You will be," I replied, "if you meet the conditions. 2 years with no high-interest debt and stable finances. Otherwise, it passes to Talia when she's of age." Serin leaned forward, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. You can't?" I held up a hand, cutting her off without raising my voice. "This isn't about you. It's about what my son allowed. You stood by while I was humiliated in front of a room full of people. You didn't say a word. Trust is not something you inherit. It's something you maintain." Darius looked down at the papers again, his jaw working as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Serin's expression hardened, but she stayed quiet now, watching me as though trying to measure how far I was willing to go. I took a sip of water, set the glass down carefully, and slid the envelope fully toward him. "The choice is yours, but I won't fund carelessness or cruelty." The silence at the table stretched unbroken as I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I could feel the weight of both their stares as I rose from my chair. I left the dining room without waiting for a response, my steps measured as I crossed the hallway toward the front door. Behind me, chairs scraped against the floor and low voices tangled. Darius saying my name, Serin, hissing something sharp, but I didn't turn around. At the door, I slipped on my coat, feeling the smooth lining against my arms. My hand was steady on the knob. Darius appeared beside me. Then his face, pale eyes darting between mine and the envelope still in his other hand. "Mom, this isn't fair," he said quietly. I met his gaze, holding it until his shoulders shifted under the weight of my silence. "Fair," I said, "would have been you standing beside me when I needed you." Serin's heels clicked against the hardwood as she joined him, her expression tightly composed. "You're making a mistake," she said, as if the authority to declare it belonged to her. I gave a small, almost involuntary smile. "No, I'm correcting one." The chill outside wrapped around me as I stepped onto the porch. My car was parked under a street lamp, the light casting a pale circle on the pavement. I walked toward it without looking back. The leather bag sat on the passenger seat, the envelope inside, like a sealed verdict. Driving home, the city lights blurred into soft ribbons along the windshield. There was no triumph in me, no rush of victory, just a steady sense of having drawn a line that would not be crossed again. When I reached my house, I hung my coat, set my keys in the bowl, and placed the bag in its usual spot on the study shelf. The room felt still, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed. But before anyone notices, the sky has cleared. I poured a glass of water, carried it to my desk, and sat down. Outside, the street was quiet, only the faint hum of a passing car breaking the silence. I knew the calls would come soon, questions, arguments, maybe even apologies. The first call came the next morning just after sunrise. I let it ring. By mid-afternoon, there were 5 missed calls and 3 voicemails, 2 from Darius, 1 from Serin, each one progressively sharper in tone. I didn't listen to them all the way through. Their words weren't what I needed to hear. Instead, I went about my day. I trimmed the rose bushes, paid the month's bills, and answered a letter from Talia's school about her upcoming science fair. The ordinary rhythm felt like a shield, each task a reminder that my life had space and shape outside of their demands. On the third day, a letter arrived by courier. Darius's handwriting on the envelope was uneven, the kind that comes when someone writes in a hurry. Inside was a single sheet, no apology, no direct admission, only a line saying he understood the terms and would do what he could to meet them. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the desk drawer with the trust documents. Weeks turned into months. We spoke occasionally, brief conversations that stayed on safe topics. The sharpness in his voice was gone, replaced by a cautious civility. I didn't push for more. Some bridges needed to be crossed slowly, if at all. By spring, I heard through Cordell that Darius had paid off one of his smaller debts and closed a few accounts. Whether it was out of pride necessity or a step toward the trust's conditions, I couldn't say. It wasn't mine to control anymore. One Sunday afternoon, Talia called to tell me about the model bridge she'd built for school. Her excitement spilled through the line, each detail bright and unguarded. When she asked if she could visit the cottage that summer, I said yes, without hesitation. After we hung up, I looked toward the study where the leather bag still sat on the shelf. It no longer felt like a burden or a weapon. It was simply there, waiting like I was, for the day it might serve as a gift again on terms that felt right to both giver and receiver.